Okay folks, here we're on harvest called Abney. We've just come down from the long cut timber sale, which you can't really see here because if you see this line of trees going along here, those are trees that weren't our trees. They're on adjacent landowners, and you can see over there is a home. And so this was a sale that was very, very close to adjacent landowners. But yeah, you'd be able to see the long cut sale behind those trees. But we came down the hill here through some commercial thinnings that we did. You may have noticed in the high speed video, maybe not, but we've thinned a lot of that hillside there that was third growth, and in the need of thinning, similar to the one stop we were at earlier on today, at the end of that road where we're getting ready to cut a second growth stand similar to this. Here's a good example of a large leaf tree group that we have. That was a wet area in there. Here's also a good example of a large landing area where a lot of processing was going on, and also in this area too, we're seeing reduced growth of these Douglas fir that we planted. You can see over there those guys that are just budding out, barely 4 feet tall, and this guy behind me and here as well. We're at this trail here that the neighbors use to get back and forth from their homes to some of the other trails out here in Tiger Mountain. We also have a dead tree here. And so all of this, as you can imagine, or not all of it, but a lot of it is due to this compacted area, and also the leaving this huge amount of carbon behind. You can see here, so this was planted about 4 years ago, and some of these trees are starting to get about 6 feet tall or so, but most of them are pretty stunted even out within the unit. And the reason is, you can see all this alder in here, and all the salmonberry is doing very, very, very well, and that's because we didn't use vegetation control here. And this is what happens if you don't use vegetation control in certain areas. You get stunted tree growth. Basically, these trees don't necessarily have very healthy leaders. Some of them are budding out sooner than others because they're just trying to survive and start photosynthesizing with the fresh new growth of the needles. And there's competition going on for water, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, all the macro and micronutrients here because of this robust understory. You also see these 10, 15, 20 foot tall clumps of big leaf maple that usually also are knocked down with herbicide, because maple is not one of our main crop tree species. If we were making guitars, it would be a different story, but maple is not as high value as Douglas fir, hemlock, or cedar, and that's kind of what we plant mainly. Doug fir and cedar is what we planted in here. Hemlock tends to come in on its own, but even in here you don't see too many volunteers. There's one probably volunteer, but a lot of areas where you see that we do use vegetation control, you'll see a lot more cedar, Douglas fir, and especially hemlock volunteers coming up. But yeah, there's another unit of this sale that we did use vegetation control on that has a very stark contrast to it as far as the amount of vegetation, the size of the vegetation. You can see here the alder are 15 feet tall to 10 feet tall. Again, the maple clumps are as well, and the salmonberry is 4 feet tall in here, and then the Douglas fir trees are only 6 feet tall. Some of them have nice leaders on them from this last year's growth, and you know, they're doing okay, but they're just not doing as good as they could be doing. I will point out, though, the reason we didn't use vegetation control was because of the neighbors. The person that lives, or the family that lives in that home there, they have bees, honeybees, and they make honey, and they didn't want us to hurt the bees with herbicide, and they also didn't want us to hurt the or affect the amount of flowers in here that their bees are getting the pollen from to make their honey. And so we agreed not to do that. However, as you can see, it is impacting the growth of our trees and the health of our trees in here. But you know, we're kind of gaining basically social capital is what we like to call it, I guess, where, you know, by doing the neighbors and the neighborhood a favor here, and you know, leaving enough leaf trees and leaving trees along their property line too, you know, to protect the view shed, and then also you know, doing what we can to protect people's you know, ways of living. You know, they're making honey, they're selling honey, it's part of, you know, their livelihood, and so we didn't want to impact that in a negative way, and agreed on not using vegetation control. Okay, so this is that same unit on the Abney harvest I was talking about. We were just right over there beyond that large leaf tree group that's protecting a small type 5 stream that's seasonal. And then I think you can start to hear some traffic noise over there. I didn't mention that Southeast Tiger Mountain Road is just about 1,000 feet that way at where the tree edge is there. And again, these are neighbors that are living along the edge of the forest there on Southeast Tiger. But here I just wanted to point out again, we didn't use vegetation control, and it's affecting the competition in here of the understory vegetation that's coming in. And you can see here these Douglas fir, when we compare them to the stand or the unit that we did use vegetation control on, you're going to see a stark contrast in leader growth, in height, overall height, and robustness of the crown as well. You know, but we do have one thing I do kind of want to point out here too, is that one of the reasons we have you know, a lot of diversity of species and different types of understory in here. These are pretty common, you know, species. We don't have a lot of invasives, which is good, because the natural native species have been allowed to come in. The thimbleberry, the huckleberry, there's some Ribes sanguineum in here, there's some Indian plum over there, and so a lot of those native shrubs are helping keep down the weedy population. And then, as we're also learning in class about microorganisms in the soil too, you know, so imagine if we had burnt back the vegetation like we do typically, even for a couple of seasons, that the dieback of the vegetation there is probably going to change the microorganisms, at least temporarily. They will probably bounce back eventually once we get a little bit more forest cover in here. And again, we're in a forest, so we're going to have a lot more fungi, and the fungi is going to love breaking down a lot of this woody material that's been added, except when it's in you know, huge piles. It takes a lot longer for it to break down there, of course, and we've seen how that affects tree growth here. But you know, these guys are struggling a little bit, but I think once they get established, the Douglas fir and the cedar in here that we plan to get established, eventually they will come around and they'll perk back up. But as you'll see in this next stop, in the next unit up here, when we do use vegetation control, what a dramatic effect it has on the establishment of the crop trees. Okie dokie, folks. Here we have another unit on the Abney sale that where we did actually use vegetation control. And so here I want to take the opportunity to point out the difference between the tree growth here and also the understory vegetation growth that we still actually have, even though we did use herbicide here about 5 years ago. And the trees are about 4 years old now, going on 5. And you can hopefully see just here on the roadside where I've pulled off in this unit, stark contrast in the difference of the growth of the trees. These trees are 8 to 10 feet tall, where the trees in the first unit we looked at were more like 6 feet tall. Some were getting to 8, but these trees have 2 to 3, 4 feet more growth. They also have than the other unit that we had not used veg control in. They also have wider, thicker, more robust crowns to them as well. And they're just, you know, kind of healthier trees, more established trees than the trees that we were seeing down in the first unit. Another thing to point out is we don't have as much vine maple, we don't have as much alder in here. We still have Sambucus racemosa, the red elderberry in here. We still have bracken fern. We still have a few other species that we had down there, but they're not quite as robust and they're not overtopping the trees. More importantly, as you know, at the other unit we had alder that were 3, 4, 5, 6 feet taller than the crop trees that we planted. And so that over time is going to affect the growth of that stand. And we'll see when we come back to harvest that stand, that unit is going to be significantly smaller in volume, have less volume basically in it during the same amount of time that this one's going to have, because we use vegetation control, burn back this vegetation temporarily, allowing these trees to establish and you know, get a firm grip on the area here and become a healthy conifer stand, which is what we're looking for, because we're trying to make revenue for the trust, right? So one thing that's pretty cool about this unit, we opened up a view of Mount Rainier that a lot of people comment on and are happy about. Even some of the hikers that I run into that are anti-logging thank me for the views every now and then that we end up opening for them. Lovely view of Mount Rainier today on this awesome spring day. And then here I'd like to point out too, in just this little micro scale here, we've got a landing obviously because we have a pile over here. And again, like I've been talking about before, this compaction of the soils here and the amount of carbon that we've left in that landing there is negatively impacting the growth of these trees. You can see they're 2 feet shorter in most cases. These trees are 4, 3, 6 feet tall, whereas the trees further into the unit there are 8 or 10 feet tall. So it's stunting the growth basically of these trees. When I get closer to this pile over here too, you can see there's a tree that's died, and you know, probably due to competition for resources. Could be nutrients, could be water, don't quite know, but you know, definitely it's really cool when you can see, you know, the impacts of what's going on below the ground, above ground, and be able to notice them on a scale like this. It doesn't happen every day, but as you know, my job as a forester and land manager, I get to come across a lot of unique opportunities like this to see how the landings do impact tree growth, and to see how vegetation control, you know, can be used in a positive way, you know, to help the next stand get established. And then yet it still comes back, you know, we still have maybe not quite the diversity that we had at the lower unit right now, but that diversity is there. It's just in smaller numbers. And And then also, you know, if we start to take that down to the micro scale and we start to think about, you know, the biodiversity and microorganisms and things like that that we've affected here, maybe by vegetation control, and then changing the soil temperature by not having any cover crop, basically, you know, kind of for our forested area here, probably chasing some of those microorganisms away. However, eventually they will come back, and you know, this is a forested area, so we have a lot of fungi influence in this area, and those fungi species will go and they live in these leaf tree groups and these riparian areas that we're leaving, and they will eventually make it back, and we'll have that kind of good biodiversity of soil organisms again, and the stand will even take off again. But you know, obviously these trees have had a good opportunity to hook up with some mycorrhizae and take off and do, you know, really good stand establishment here. This is a success story and a great opportunity to show what happens when you use vegetation control and when you don't. And also, you get to enjoy a nice view of Mount Rainier.